Welcome to the Ayurveda podcast for complex health. We feature expert guests who dive into ancient and cutting-edge understandings of health and disease. These conversations are about food, lifestyle, and medicine just as much as about nature, culture, and politics. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine, coming to you from our clinic, Ayurveda Health, in Seattle, Washington. And I'm really excited about our very poignant guest this morning. And this is Dr. Prita Lal. She was raised as a child of South Asian immigrants in the American South. She became interested in social justice issues at a young age and now teaches at Evergreen State College, my alma mater, at the intersections of food and environmental justice, social movements, Black studies, solidarity economics, cooperative education, healing justice, and community-based learning. Dr. Lal completed her BA in French and anthropology at Tulane, her master's and doctorates in sociology at Stony Brook University, and her teaching style focuses on education for transformation and liberation. She also has completed extensive training in yoga and Ayurveda, the ancient system of healing from South Asia. We know that well here on our podcast. And she integrates these through somatic and trauma-informed teaching practices. Her work analyzes the root causes of social problems, not intending to paralyze, but rather inform just alternatives to transform rather than recreate systemic injustices. Dr. Lal, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. Excited to be here.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. So, we are like 3 weeks into Trump being president. And so there's been a lot of changes. And we planned this for a long time, this podcast. So this is not, in response to anything that's happened nationally or globally, but it certainly does seem poignant. And so I want to start with kind of like, let's get on common ground. So could you talk to us about like when you talk in the academic sense or the activism sense of words like Black studies, anthropology, political economy and political science, food justice, ethnic studies, agriculture, like talk to us about what do these words mean? What are you studying? What is the thinking about? And talk to us about that. Let's start there.
Great. Well, I just wanted to say thank you again, because I really love being able to talk about the intersections of these topics. And it's rare for me to have like an opportunity to do this. So thank you again. Thinking about like the different terms, I know, especially with a lot of the news things going on, like there's different sort of targeting of certain types of education, if it's things like critical race theory, which is a more sort of like legal kind of like framework that's connected to like anti-racism education, which is kind of education I've been doing for a long time, or like with ethnic studies targeting of those kinds of programs, or DEI, for example. But ultimately, I feel like, a lot of these terms kind of refer to, I feel like a similar kind of underlying concept, which is just really, ultimately, it's really about just giving voice to a lot of the perspectives that have been on the margins in our society, and really just by doing that and really like elevating the voices of those most on the margins, we're able to make the world more fair and more just, which ultimately benefits all of us. And I know later on we'll talk more about the intersections of Ayurveda and social justice, but that's one teaching from the Vedas about how we're all interconnected. We have this interbeing. And so ultimately, I think that's what like these different areas of study kind of help us to understand is our interconnectedness in these ways. And so, really, and I think and a lot of it is just unlearning how the world that we've been taught to sort of operate in doesn't really, for many of us, doesn't really serve us. And so just unlearning a lot of that and just, really getting that interconnectedness piece that we've been disconnected from society.
All right. And what does that look like in the academic sense? Like, what are your classes? What are the topics of your classes? And how do your students kind of respond to this education?
Well, definitely. I was hired to teach food justice, food policy. And so my background's in sociology too, as you mentioned. And so, really a lot of it is just looking at different dimensions of power, how power kind of operates both. So kind of looking at like in our food system, but really like society as a whole. And we talk about how like, it's more than just food. Like we can't really have justice in the food system unless it's connected to justice in all different areas of society and the whole ecosystem. So, definitely there's, I think, with the students, Evergreen attracts a more kind of like different kind of student that's really interested in making a difference in the world. And so there's definitely a lot of hunger there for those intersections. And then also I think what's interesting about teaching food justice is that there's a big applied component that's a part of it too. So it can't just be like theoretical, like in the classroom, like learning concepts and that academic pieces, but we have to be like actually in the field, like doing the work. And so, yeah, so we have a lot of amazing partnerships with different community organizations, many of them started by our alumni that are doing work for food justice that our students collaborate with. And or they, we have a farm on campus or different like gardens and things like that. So there's the opportunity for them to get their hands like literally in the soil, in the dirt. And I think that also is really helpful because it can feel really like emotionally like heavy to learn about these, about all the challenges like in our food system and like the way corporations have been like concentrating power and in ways that are like harming people and the planet and stuff. And then learning about the histories of how these systems came to be. So we study the histories of especially the United States with settler colonialism and enslavement and how that's built our food system. And so that gets really heavy. And so it has like an emotional toll for sure on students. So it's really valuable to integrate the applied hands-on pieces too, because that sort of ignites more hope. So we're able to engage in the critique but not get paralyzed in it, but then also have a sharp lens so that way the solutions that we're working for have integrity too. So,
you just said so many great things. And it reminds me, I know we talked about this kind of in past conversations, but my background, I mentioned Evergreen was my alma mater. I came out to Washington State to go to Evergreen State College in 1993. And my first program was ecological agriculture. And I was really interested in forestry. And it was the closest thing. And I really hoped they weren't going to do a lot on farming because farming seemed pretty boring. And wow, was I surprised. It was, and that balance of doing like entomology and soil science and bug science and chemistry, the chemistry of soil and how soil holds together, how soil holds nutrients. And we've learned so much since then about how trees and plants communicate together. The largest living organism on the planet, I've been told, is some 3-mile wide mycelium network. And I think somewhere here in the Pacific Northwest, is that right? And so there's so much to learn. And then that was really balanced by our seminar programs where we really started to unravel, or at least for me, I really started to learn about the history of food. And I'm wondering food and food justice and what food justice means. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of structural justice or structural injustice, like about that relationship between power and resource?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Yeah. So I think when we're thinking about structural justice, one thing that, maybe just to elaborate a little bit more on these different types of power, because that ultimately is a core issue when in various like sort of movements for justice coming back down to power. So for instance, with food justice, when people ask like what that is, it's really giving, creating a system so that way the people have direct control and power over their food system. And so rather than corporations. And so thinking about structural justice right now, we have, in our dominant food system, the mainstream food system, we have a very small number of corporations that control most of the market in all aspects of the food system. So from production, in terms of what inputs get used in farming and kind of how the scale of what farming looks like, consumption, in terms of the various like food processors that, that also that create a lot of the processed foods that's like available in the grocery stores. And, just in various, all the different areas of the food system, there's this massive concentration of power. So then, and also because these industries are prioritizing their profits over like the providing like nutrient dense foods, for example, or food that's grown like in an ecological way in harmony with the environment, that there's a lot of externalized costs, like just various harms that come about as a result in terms of like all the various like chemicals that are used in our foods or in our agriculture that haven't been properly tested. And then how that has like various impacts on people's health and the environmental health. And so these are some of when we're thinking about structural justice, looking at these like issues around inequality with power. And so movement for food justice are really about bringing power back to the people to be able to grow food that's culturally relevant, culturally significant, also in ways that's harmonious with the earth to regenerate the life processes in the ecosystems. And thinking about like, what power is ultimately, it's an ability to do something, to be able to do. And so right now, like I like to kind of start off like when I'm teaching my classes, like in the first part of my curriculum, kind of looking at how there's been a massive paradigm shift when we're thinking about like power, for example. So if we go back to how like human beings have lived for most of like the time that humans have been on Earth, there's referred to as the paradigm of holism. Like we lived in a way where like, to quote like indigenous peoples, like it's, human beings understood that everything is alive and we're all related. So it's like humans have been embedded in this like web of life, not superior to or better than, or just interconnected in this web of life. And then this rupture happened, and then I call it the logic of empire became more dominant. And under like sort of the empire logic, it's this idea of separation. So humans are now like separate from the natural world, and then superior, have dominion over the whole natural world. And so this sort of like juncture, and it's interesting to think about like agriculture today is holding sort of like potential for many solutions of like some of the biggest like problems facing us today. It's interesting to think about how like perhaps agriculture was part of like this disconnect, because with the agricultural revolution, some 10,000 some years ago, it was like this separation again between like kind of wild plants and then domesticated plants, and that sort of was the foundations of this separation. But so I think like under the logic of empire, like power also becomes distorted. So under holism, this kind of holism, it's like we have this different notions of power. There's power within us, our body's innate ability to self-heal. It's like, I feel like an amazing superpower that we've been disconnected from in our modern society. And then we have like power to work cooperatively and collaboratively with other people, with other species, and so that's really been like how humans have lived for most of the time on this earth. But then, say like 10,000 years ago, and it's become more and more exacerbated with colonialism, it's like 500 some years ago. And then in our modern era with all the power that corporations have today, power has just gotten more concentrated in a more domineering way. So like power over is this like the more dominant form of power, where it's based more on coercion, force, hierarchies. And so I think that's also a big piece of like what's going on here, like why like so many issues around injustices are happening in our food system, in our healthcare system, and in various other systems too. It's just like that power over has become the more like pervasive form of power, and we've gotten disconnected from that power within and that power with. So a lot of it is like kind of shining light on these different aspects, because once we become more conscious of it, then we can like become more aware in our actions and come up with solutions to help address them.
So let's, in this conversation of power and resource, like let's look a little bit about Ayurvedic medicine specifically. Talk to us, tell us a little bit about Ayurveda. I think a lot of our listeners know I've talked about it a lot, but if this is kind of the first podcast that somebody might be listening to from our show, like talk a little bit about Ayurveda and then how that relates to what you're talking about.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah, well, maybe I can also like share a little bit, because it might help to understand kind of how I kind of make these connections between Ayurveda and the social justice pieces, like in terms of my own journey. Like, so yeah, as you mentioned before, I grew up the child of immigrants. My parents migrated from India to the US in the early 70s. Yeah, growing up in South Asian culture, there was a lot of, now I realize there's a lot of like kind of Ayurveda practices that were sort of like embedded in the culture, but I didn't necessarily understand like the underlying like ideas and sort of cosmologies behind them, but until I did my more intensive studies. But yeah, understanding like Ayurveda as the for folks that are kind of newer to this, it's a considered to be by many one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continually practiced system of holistic health, wellness, and healing. And originates from, what we call like modern day India now, the South Asian subcontinent. And it's a holistic way of healing, understanding the sort of integration of body, mind, and spirit. And I think when I was talking about the kind of a holism, there's a lot of ways that Ayurveda, like the underlying cosmologies and philosophies and principles of Ayurveda help to illustrate this idea of holism. So a lot of it is finding balance in our health when we reestablish the connection that each individual has to the bigger universe that we're in, the idea of the micro and the macro. So like we are each microcosm to the bigger macrocosm that we're in, the bigger like universe that we're in. And the universe is a macrocosm of us as microcosm. And so that's a big piece. And so I think for me in my journey, like I just growing up in the South, just really I feel like I got politicized at an early age, understanding like a lot of injustices, particularly racial injustices, learning a lot from Black communities. Like my first teachers and like my educational experiences have have been Black, and so getting involved in racial justice work from an early age and anti-racism education, and then doing like ethnic studies classes too in college, African American history especially. And so, for me, I think just getting more involved in social justice work, particularly when I went to graduate school in New York City, working with different immigrant communities, low-income communities, and just noticing a lot of burnout, for instance, among the different colleagues I had that were also community organizers or advocates, and very well respected in the field. Like I got to mentor with some really amazing people, and I just felt like there was something missing. It felt like a contradiction. Here we're working to make the world more fair and more just, but then we're like getting sick as a result of doing that. And so it just felt like there was a big piece missing there. And so in my journey, I ended up getting connected to an organization called Casa Aterbe Sache, which was at that time was based in the South Bronx. And it was called the House of Women's Power. And so we did these monthly healing circles for women of color, and they were based on different earth-based forms of healing modalities. The mission of the group was really to link spirituality and social justice. And so that's where I started learning a lot more about the more kind of like connecting to like this bigger like cosmos that we're in, and like understanding our interconnectedness piece. And so, so I think that was like, I think I see a lot of these connections that I see practices like Ayurveda and like through like the holistic healing, they offer tools for us to connect more to our power within. And so by understanding that we're not just these isolated beings, but we're part of these bigger wholes, and that we can harness a lot of power when we connect our sort of day-to-day like lives and actions with the energies of the universe around us, that's a source of power. And then once as we're empowered beings, and we can like really build our power in collective ways with others to build alternative movements to these domineering systems that we're in. And so I think that's how I see them connected. And without that, I feel like without like sort of that healing work and these like this wellness piece being at the core of social justice work, I notice a lot of patterns, both in my personal experiences being a part of different social movements and in my academic sort of studies of like historical movements and things, like just patterns where it's like, people in social movements and end up carrying a lot of trauma in their bodies, because there's oftentimes people are drawn to social movements because of like horrendous things that have happened to them that they're working to overcome and want to create a better world so other people don't have to go through what they went through. And then there's also the intergenerational pieces too, people who like are descendants of those that were like went through like targeted by policies around genocide or enslavement and things like that. So there's a lot of like unsettled trauma, and so we end up just like recreating that onto each other within movements, and sort of like oppress people but becoming oppressors. Oftentimes like a pattern I would notice. I think that it's really vital, I think, to like be able to like bring in these kinds of offerings that that like, for instance, that Ayurveda has to offer us, because I think it can help. I know for me, as I've been studying Ayurveda, I feel like more of a whole person to myself, like, and I think we can bring more wholeness to our movements too in that way as well.
Fantastic. And so what are some of those principles from Ayurveda that you really rely on in the justice work?
Thanks. So you mentioned that healing justice area that I teach in too. So in the past like couple of years, I started teaching a healing justice course that's been really great, and a chance for me to dive deeper into some of these threads that we're talking about. And one practice that I have students work on in the class is that they create their own dinacharya, which I feel like is sort of the I heard one person refer to it as the crown jewel of Ayurveda. So just to say a little bit about the dinacharya, it's so again, this idea of like the micro and the macro, that we're each microcosms of the bigger macrocosm. And there's the 5 great elements in Ayurveda, ether, air, fire, water, and earth. And each of these elements make up the whole universe and cosmos that we're in. And they're also found within each of our bodies. And these elements are both like physical. They're also like, they represent different energies, different qualities. And so through the dinacharya, we're able to, the idea is that we align our day-to-day actions with the rhythms of like the earth and like the universe that we're in. And so when we have that alignment, then we're able to harness power from the universe to support our day-to-day actions. And then our actions become more effective in that. And so for example, things like there's a lot of ways that like the Western science like supports this too, with the circadian rhythms. And so, but this sort of diurnal clock, like the kind of aligning our internal clocks with like the sun, for example. And so like, but the times that we wake up, the times that we go to sleep, the times that we eat, all that can be like better supported for us to have more restful sleep and stronger digestion and assimilation of our foods. And so some of the specifics are, in Ayurveda, it's recommended to go to sleep by 10 p.m., for example, and then waking up by 6 a.m. That's when we have the most restful, restorative sleep. There's also the doshas and the elements. And so those 5 great elements show up in different combinations in people's bodies, specifically in the doshas. And so like sleeping during the pitta time of night, which is like the fire and water elements, pitta represents the energies of digestion and assimilation. And so between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., for example, it's the pitta time of night, we're able to really digest our like thoughts and emotions and what happened to us during the day. And a lot of like, again, the Western science kind of studies on like REM sleep, REM sleep, it aligns with this as well. And some of the sleep cycles that we have our most restorative sleep during those hours. And so, for example, I also see it as like really powerful to like sort of unwind in the evening time between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. That's like the kapha time in the evening, which is kapha kind of brings in the can have more of those energies of like more stillness, more sort of like kind of like a little bit more like tapping into more of the energies around like winding down and kind of like chilling out. so thinking about, I feel like it's really a valuable practice to also think about how to like disconnect more from like the physical world, the material realm that we're in, and sort of go within. So that's one thing that I think is really beautiful about sleep. It's like it's a really like sacred experience because our consciousness is able to leave our physical bodies and go into this like other realm through our dreams, for example, which happened again really powerfully during like that pitta time of night. And so like so a chance to wind down is also a way to kind of like let go of like all the productivity that we're expected of in our society. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to keep working. I'm not going to keep consuming. I'm just going to like unplug and like start to like do my evening routine to kind of like signal to my body, okay, it's time to like go into like a resting state of rest. And then, then it's easier to fall asleep too if you go to sleep before 10 p.m. And then it's, easier to wake up if we wake up before 6 a.m., which is like the vata time. Between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. is the vata time. So they call it, there's like this ambrosia hour, like between 4 and 6 a.m., kind of waking up before the sun comes up. And there's like a veil being lifted because that's transition from night to day represents like death and then life coming back after death. So those cycles. And so that like transition time period between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. is very potent energy. Ayurveda sees like transitions as being very powerful. The transitions from one season to the next or like from night to day. And so that's a good chance to like, with that veil being lifted, for us to have really deep meditation, to get messages from the universe, things like that. So that's also like a powerful experience to align like those kinds of activities during that time of day. And then exercising first thing in the morning, like between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., for example, during that kapha time in the morning. Kapha also has the energies of building, structure, strength, stamina. So it's like we can really energize ourselves. Even doing like 20, 30 minutes exercise in the morning can help kind of fuel us for the whole day. And I think another major piece of the Dinacharya is like having lunch during that pitta time in the afternoon, which is 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. is the pitta time during the day, but then eating lunch kind of in the middle of that around noon, 12:30 is when our digestion is the strongest. So the idea is that when the sun is like the highest in the sky, that's when our internal kind of fire, internal sun or Agni is the strongest. And so that's when we can handle like the largest meal, eating our largest meal at that time, which will then kind of keep us fueled for the rest of the day. And so, just kind of doing these practices around like, you don't even have to like buy anything to like do these things. You don't have to like change your consumption patterns necessarily. I mean, in terms of like, it's not about eating this superfood or avoiding that like demonized food. It's just like working with where you're at and just like changing the timings of when you're doing things that doesn't really cost any money. So I appreciate the Dinacharya for that as well, because it's not about like participating more in our like commodified culture, but you can sort of like still see health benefits just by, again, changing the timings of what you do. That's totally free. Like you don't have to buy it. You don't have to pay for it. And it's something that by doing this too, I feel like it's a chance to reclaim that power within also, because we realize that like, that these choices I make when I'm acting in ways that's in alignment with the bigger universe, I can connect to the power again of this bigger cosmos that I'm in. And then that helps to like, that's a source of power too, that we realize that we're not just like these like isolated beings, but we're part of a bigger whole. So it's a way to tap into that kind of power as well, to ignite that power within. So I think that's also, a really beautiful piece of the Dinacharya.
Yes, amazing. What you gave was just an incredible exposition about Dinacharya, about the daily routine. And just to highlight some of the points that you just made are, it goes around the clock. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily change who you are or how you dress or what kind of work you do. It does, I think, highlight how difficult shift work can be. And I think that there are, so it does juxtapose, work in life. If you are having to do shift work or work a swing shift, if you are a new mama, with a baby and you don't have support that humans have had, that new mamas have had for, millennia, then you are often on call and up at the night and at the day. And we can see through that recommendation of Dinacharya how harmful that can be, how challenging that can be. And I will say harmful. I think that it really hurts women's health, new parents' health when they have to be up with a baby and then working a 40-hour work week, let alone often 50, 60-hour work weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. And that's why I think it's so important. Like what you're saying just highlights the importance of connecting these activities to ignite the power within that we can tap into through like the holistic healing, and not leaving it there, having to like do that building power collectively, power with being part of movements to really transform these like structures that really are creating so much harm in our society. These work cultures that the isolation piece that like parents or like moms, if they're a single mom, that they have to like do all the like laboring by themselves to like care for like these babies that we've lost with that village kind of culture, that because of that individualism, the isolation that's so predominant in our society today. And certainly like the work cultures around like kind of this having to be productivity around the clock type of thing. That's also for sure. There's a lot of ways our society has to change to really support everybody to be able to do the Dinacharya. But that's part of it. Again, that's part of it. Like do the internal work and then we do the collective work too. So it's both in a dialogue for sure.
So let's think about like what guidance can Ayurveda give us in terms of, or what guidance can you give us actually, Dr. Lal, specifically about how do we transition from understanding kind of like personal wellness or like, this is my routine, I'm going to eat now sort of thing, to collective wellness, and as well to kind of movements for social justice?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's great. That's a great question. That question, it reminds me of this concept of like community care that comes up. That when I was doing the healing circle work previously, I mentioned the group Casa Ate Besace in New York. I was part of different cohorts, part of that group where we would do these more intensive trainings with some of the mentors that founded that work. And I remember in one of the cohorts, we were actually having discussions around like self-care and how that's different from community care. And so oftentimes in a lot of social justice work, sometimes self-care gets critiqued a lot for being very individualistic and like people with privilege. And, it's like, who has money to go to the yoga studio and do these things. And it's like, it's kind of, criticized in these different ways, maybe also thought of as being kind of like too concerned with oneself. Whereas like there's a tendency for activists to want to like martyr themselves for a bigger movement, things like that. So it's kind of critiqued in those ways. So, but again, if we hold like the both and seeing what's valuable in like self-care practices, but then also, understanding like the limitations for many people to do those things. Like the idea of community care was something that folks were talking about as a response to like self-care. So really bringing like these practices into the culture of our organizing, into our organization. So instead of feeling like, okay, I can only go to a yoga class like after work is done and do it on my own time, and that kind of privileges people that have the time and the resources and stuff. But bringing it more into like our culture. So maybe starting our meetings with some grounding practices and like, some movement, some asanas, some pranayama, some breath work, or like, some movement and stuff like that. And then, having these tools there, like maybe supporting people, understanding that like, okay, if we need to like pause the work to go and like, maybe we're going to stop and like, we're just going to like maybe do some like, some embodiment work, some somatic work, some yoga in this moment, like that's also valued. And that's part of our work, that really, those activities will help us to be more grounded, be more present, which then will help us to do our work more effectively, help us fulfill our dharma, our purpose more effectively. I think maybe just shifting some of the cultures to around like how we measure work that's valuable, like oftentimes even in people that are, again, trying to create like alternatives to our dominant system through like in social justice communities, like there can be a lot of internalization of like the productivity culture that like our worth is determined by the number of hours we're putting into doing a specific task, or like how many people we can like bring to meetings, or just kind of quantifying in different ways. But thinking about like the qualitative piece too around like, okay, well, how well do we feel, and like how clear is our thinking, and just like so our focus and things like that, how all these things can be improved if we like slow down and like build in like space to do some of these like care practices, but in community. So it's not like on each individual on themselves to try to do it on their own time, but it can be built in more to how we're organizing and stuff, how we're relating to each other.
So when I'm I'm like making mental notes
yeah
for nerve health. So part of it, is kind of integrating those pieces into the work day. Just like, like going directly back to Dinacharya, even just recognizing that as an organization to be able to support taking breath, or, doing yoga or asanas or bodily movements or pranayama breath.
Mm-hmm.
How do you recommend that people kind of find each other? You know what I mean? Like if you're a listener and you're like, oh, I want to be connected in like, how do you find or connect with a community like that?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not part of one of these kind of groups inherently, like if you are not Black, or if you are not female, or if you are not like, where do you go to, or if you're not a farmer, like, how do you find community? I guess that's what I'm asking.
No, that's a good question. And that's, that's something I'm still, it's like actually, a process for me too, actually, because I feel like I'm, I think about in my journey, like the community that I was talking about in New York City, like that's probably the closest I found where I was really able to like weave in these like passions of mine in a really like authentic way, in terms of the healing, the spirituality pieces, and the social justice pieces. And so, I'll be honest, it can be like a struggle for me too, to kind of really find like sort of my community, my people around it. That's why I was so excited when you wanted to have this conversation, because it's rare for me to find people that want to talk about these kind of intersections. So, but I would say that like definitely finding your people, like it doesn't, we could always start small too. Like it doesn't have to be like, a huge, like a massive group, like even just like finding your pod of like, 3 to 5 people that like kind of have shared like interests, or even just like are curious. They may not be perfect. I think getting away from those ideas like perfectionism, we talked about that earlier in our earlier conversations, but just like, it's just a process. And so, finding folks that are like interested, even though they may not be totally like masterful of like these kind of practices right away, but that's okay. Like as long as the interest is there and like working towards it, I think that's great. That's folks that we can work with. And then, I think like building community too. Like I noticed one thing about like food, like going back to like the food justice piece, like that's one thing about like some food justice organizations that I've like either studied or like worked with. Many of them, they sort of center their organizing around food, not so much because they're like the founders of those groups were like foodies, they just love food, but they just saw food as like a good way to bring people together. So like, if you have like offering people like a meal, like folks will come in the door, and then once they're there, then you can start to talk to them about maybe some of the political pieces that they want to organize around or things like that. So I just always think about that. Like food is a really powerful way to bring people together for those folks that are seeking community. So like you could start with that too, just like, maybe, opening space if folks have that, just to like, shared meals, even if it's just like potlucks. Okay, everybody bring a dish, and then we'll just like gather around that. And then, there can be dialogue around like, hey, are folks interested in like, kind of maybe doing some like community care activities together, or whatever, whatever the interests are that people want to like kind of spend time like organizing around, or wherever there's an issue happening in the neighborhood and community, people want to start like addressing and working on together, like things like that. But I think that's like a really powerful piece. And I think just like, again, like, and like I said too, just thinking about like the critical relationship rather than critical mass. It's something Adrienne Ray Brown has said before, or other people probably have said it before too, but not feeling like, that our community has to be sort of like live in like size, like those like critical connections are very valuable too, even if it's with like a smaller kind of pod. So kind of starting with that too. And then I think as like folks find that, then they can start to attract others that will be like drawn into that work, and then it will grow from there.
That's fantastic. That's a great way to think about it. Critical relationships versus critical mass that you're looking for. And I think often in relationships, our culture really prioritizes like romantic relationships, or or we romanticize romantic relationships. And romantic relationships are really relationships that are fairly insular. Like you're not in I think in our culture, you're not necessarily in a romantic relationship in community. And so the idea that you would find a person, or you would find a couple people, you were saying 3 to 5 people, or a small pod, or even just one person who you have aligned interests and you want to do similar work together. That is a different sort of relationship. That is essentially a relationship, a critical relationship that looks at doing something in the world. And whether it be two new parents getting kids out into the woods for the day, or whether, and then attracting other people and eventually having, like we have in Seattle, the Hike It Baby Facebook group or whatever it is. But, just starting with trying to find people out there who have your similar interests. And I think that, could you speak a little bit to kind of how our culture has really commoditized spaces so much? Everything is commoditized. It's like we have a bookstore here called Third Place Books, just because it's like there's work and there's home, but we really don't have in our culture right now a lot of third places. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. Public spaces and things, those are all like really valuable parts of building community too. I'm just thinking about like some of the research I did, and when I was getting my PhD for my dissertation, I was researching about the relationship between urban agriculture and gentrification in New York City. And some of what I was finding was that like in communities where there was like a long histories of redlining, like historic, like just predominantly Black neighborhoods that had been like sort of disconnected from various like kind of financial and other kind of resources, the community started building gardens as a way to reclaim their neighborhoods from a lot of like disinvestment. And the gardens were like, it wasn't even so much about like that growing food was an important part of it, but it was really about growing community like in those spaces. And then it was a source of empowerment that people would reclaim like some trash filled lot and turn it into like this beautiful, like vibrant kind of like ecosystem, and things like and life coming back and all these things like birds and pollinators, all these things. People felt like the source of empowerment. They're like, okay, now if I could do this, we could do this together, then what other issues can we take out? We can make our schools more fair, like address issues around housing and stuff. But yeah, just think about the role of like the spaces, the physical spaces too, so important. And then there was a lot of work to protect those spaces from being privatized. Later on, as a city tried to like sell a lot of the gardens off to developers and things, and then they become more like private like spaces for the gardens for the people that can afford like it's really high rents and stuff. But yeah, no, totally. Yeah, let me see if I have like a more coherent kind of like response. But I think like
great. I think that what I'm pulling from what you're saying is really, we start with, you really have made a very cohesive argument for a progression using the principles of Ayurveda and from the Vedas about setting up our dinacharya. So kind of rooting down into ourselves without a lot of even necessarily tech or labs, or kind of without these sort of objective feedback pieces, but really rooting into ourselves and our structure of our daily life, the things that we do, and then kind of trying to include that as we can into our businesses, but then developing these relationships, these deep relationships. Like, what was the sentence that you used, the AJ Brown, the critical relationships over critical mass, and then kind of spreading out into territory and just claiming space, and have that be gardens, or have that be, you can even do like 5-gallon bucket gardening in your front yard. You are right. We live here in Seattle on a street, and my kiddo was really obsessed with like big Tonka trucks, not always Tonka, but like big trucks. And so we used to have like a whole array of trucks in our front yard. And what it ended up happening was occasionally families that were like, their kids had outgrown, they would just like drop those trucks off. And then occasionally families with other young kids would come by, and we'd be like, oh yeah, take some trucks. And so there was this whole like revolving kind of unit of trucks in our front yard for a couple of years. And I think about like how much, if it's like one of those, like, if you build it, they will come sort of thing, that if you're wanting to build that critical mass out of those critical relationships, this is how you do it. And starting with land, space, things that are not commodified, that people can just be drawn to and access and locally, then, garden, just keep shouting at gardens, 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 because with land, you are connected. And you are right that being with land and having your hands in the soil is a balm for social and political ills of today. That these human relationships that are causing chaos on our political scene, cannot interrupt our hands in the dirt unless they, interrupt where we can be with our person and our body. But beyond that, it's like you can always put your hands back into the soil and claim your birthright as an animal on the planet, as a person.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Robin Wall, can remember, said that too in the Perfect Braiding Sweetgrass, that like, yeah, when we feel like we just don't know what to do with the problems of the world, or just becoming so daunting or so like overwhelming, not sure what to do. She's like, yeah, time to garden. Like that's that just that's yeah. So that's a great step. Yeah, definitely. And there's so many, thinking about like what you said before about there not being like the privatization of so many like public spaces, and yeah, we see that in a lot of cities too, gentrification and things. That yeah, there's still when thinking about gardens, that there's still a lot of opportunity with there's a lot of like there's access that folks can have. I think about like, again, a lot of the community gardens I worked with, many of them started, some of them were just like, we call them guerrilla gardens, like they would just throw what they call like seed bombs like into like vacant lots and they just started planting stuff like that way. But yeah, there's like different like public agencies, like they own like a lot of different like lots that usually aren't being used, or oftentimes aren't being used for anything. And so there's like different ways that like people can like reclaim spaces again for building community that way. Or yards. Yeah, a lot of people have like yards instead of having grass. Like, you could like have gardens even with like containers, starting off with some containers. It's a great starting point. So yeah, there is an interesting community garden project we used to have collaborated with in the past, and Tacoma, Washington, the Hilltop Urban Gardens. And what was interesting about like their model is that they would work with different just like private like homeowners and just ask them for permission about building gardens on like their yards. And then that would be part of like their sort of network. They had like a network of various like gardens on these different like just people's yards and stuff. And so it wasn't like they didn't even necessarily have to like sort of like purchase land from the city or like whatever, acquire like their own like sort of designated community garden, but they were able to sort of create this like patchwork of various gardens around the neighborhood. And it felt like it was kind of an interesting way to kind of, here we had like private land, but then it's sort of like reestablishing this sort of like commons of most of like these gardens and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways people were creative about it. But I think a lot of it too is like speaking to, what you said too, the Tonka truck idea of like building community that way. Like, just finding like and this is something I think about too with the Vedas as well, and like the ancient like texts that Ayurveda is based on. But this idea of like, so there's like 4 main aims of life. One of them is like having purpose, like dharma. And so in order to like sort of find your purpose, I think just connecting to like whatever excites you, like what sort of like lights your fire, your inner fire, because I feel like that's sort of the universe also. That's like a message from the universe saying like, okay, this is like part of my purpose now. And so whatever the exact like sort of like project or practices might be to like build community, just like there's a lot of different ways to do it. And so just like, again, like connect within, which I think having like a balanced dinacharya in this way, like being able to like, again, meditating during that Ambrosia hour, for example, is a good way to sort of get the most amazing downloads, like way like deeper than the World Wide Web downloads, but kind of downloading from the universe to get that clarity, and then like kind of finding what your spark is, and then like sharing that with the universe is a powerful way to practice dharma. And then that's a way to like as you like are fuller into your purpose, then that can help inspire others and kind of attract them into your life and build community in that way. But it can look like a lot of different ways too. So I think that was just one piece too.
The dharma piece I think is really interesting, and I do see in a lot of activism circles there's so much drive and passion, right? Like a lot of people don't find themselves there out of like by accident. People make choices to kind of be in those communities or to function in that way, to call themselves an activist, to feel like they're ready to like take on something and drive something. And so the idea that all of us have dharma, the idea that all of us have purpose, the idea that all of us are here for a reason, I think that is really unique to Ayurvedic medicine. And I think it really like calls for a standout, kind of like a standing ovation even, that Ayurveda says that the health of the individual your life helps the evolution of the universe. So that you are a requirement, that you belong, and that you have a place here, and that you have a job, and that your role is really to help the evolution of the universe. So I think that's
beautiful.
You don't see that in Western medicine. In Western medicine, our goal is to like, stop symptoms, make you better, which means essentially problemless, which is not Veda, make you problemless so you can go back to being productive, so that you can go back to your widget, get back on the line, either, assume your role as a capitalist, like owning capital and directing capital, important, or being a worker, contributing to that capitalist. And so those are kind of, Western medicine in some ways, although I will say Western medicine has developed some incredible tools, and so the tools we can still use in Ayurveda. The tools are appropriate in any system, but that in that Western medicine system, when you go to medical school, you go to nurse practitioner school, there's not a lot of discussion about what is your health for. It's kind of like the individual.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For sure. Yeah, no, I love how you say that too, that about the, our purpose is here to help evolve like this bigger universe that we're in, that we're part of this bigger whole. That's really beautiful. And yeah, I think that, yeah, no, for sure. I think it's interesting to think about many of the teachers that like my Ayurveda teachers, and I think a lot of the Ayurveda doctors that are sort of like helping to lead more like Ayurveda education and sort of expand it in the US have a very interesting take, like thinking about like sort of the Nama folks or people like Dr. La that wrote the textbooks that we use and stuff. And it's interesting because they have a big focus on like integrate, like seeing how Ayurveda can integrate into Western medicine. And I think, yeah, what you said, that there can totally be like a lot of like ways that for sure that Western medicine offers like certain tools that certainly could be like integrated with Ayurveda and stuff for sure. I think the one thing that I kind of struggle with is that, again, thinking about like when you mentioned capitalism, the fact that like our dominant healthcare system is a for-profit one as well. And so that also speaks to what you were saying to around like, okay, symptom management, we've got to cut off the symptoms and get you back into, so you can be a cog in the wheel, productive cog in the wheel. And that's it, but it's like, yeah, there's so much more to that, but yeah, I think like that's one of the main issues I see today too, is that so much of the standards of care in like our dominant healthcare system are made for profit reasons, like financial reasons, rather than like the well-being of like the people and stuff. And so, and that's the thing about Ayurveda too, such personalized medicine is very individualized. It's not like a universal kind of like, okay, this is your diagnosis, and then this is like if what we're going to do, sort of like everything's sort of like pre-laid out in that way. But yeah, no, so I do think that like, yeah, ultimately that's probably one thing that needs to definitely shift, is a decommodifying our healthcare system in order to truly make it like integrative in that way. That could be so powerful. But yeah, again, thinking about power. So taking that power over, and that one piece around power over is that like, within like the holism paradigm, it's like the economies were very different. Like the way people sort of like you are kind of like used or managed like sort of like the natural resources of the earth and consumed and produced, like all that happened in a very different sort of economy that was more aligned with like ideas around the gift economy. If people have maybe like heard that, or that's something you can definitely look up, the gift economy or the solidarity economy. Whereas like with empire, it's definitely like the capitalist economy where like profit for the owners of, kind of like private property gets established, and then the owners of private property are the ones that like their profit motives is like central. And so that right there, I think, feeds into a lot of this like domineering sort of power over where decisions get made for the interest of profit rather than the interest of like the sort of the use value that health has, which is to like heal people and help people find more balance and stuff. And so, yeah, so I think that's like one piece of that until we can kind of like grapple with that. I feel like it's going to be sort of like this disconnect of how can you really integrate Ayurveda into the system? And it's a little bit dumbfounded by that.
I mean, I would say from my perspective, having studied Ayurveda 25 years and been in healthcare over 20, I mean, like Western, being a nurse for over 20 years, I would say to me, Ayurveda, it's more natural. It's a more natural fit to integrate Western medicine into Ayurveda. Like that Ayurveda is the foundation and we layer on Western treatments on top.
Yeah.
And to me, that is what makes the most logical sense. I think it is really difficult to think about bringing Ayurveda to Western medicine, but I am interested and kind of committed to trying. So
Totally.
I keep talking about kind of the principles of digestion, or the principles of you were talking about the 4 aims of life, talking about the why do you want your health, there are aspects of Western medicine which are coming to that. The VA is doing an incredible job with whole health, a whole health model, more about the why of health, but it's not in the structure from the Vedas. And I think that there remain these kind of like gaping chasms of reason and logic in how we are progressing in Western medicine that Ayurveda easily fills. So
yeah, no, that's great. That's great. It's great to hear, like, especially your experiences being a right in the field practitioner for so many years. That's awesome. I think about too when you said about the it fits more organically to kind of start with the foundation of Ayurveda and then sort of layer in like the Western practices. It makes me think about, again, I know maybe this is probably, some people may not agree, but there's definitely some like folks like scholars and practitioners that argue that Ayurveda is like sort of like the oldest system of like medicine and healing and health care, and then the idea is that it went up north and became traditional Chinese medicine in China, and then went out like I guess from that direction it would have been like east, yeah, if you went like in that direction towards Europe, and then I went to allopathic medicine, and I could see that because there are like because when we think about allopathy, like we think about like the idea of like sort of taking a whole and kind of like breaking it down into parts, but like this idea of specialization, like they have that too. In Ayurveda, there's different like kind of there's specialization that existed in like the ancient system, and then like surgery was practiced in ancient India. There's a lot of these things that it's like okay, was it just like only these are like some.
I mean, the 8 branches of Ayurveda are like ear, nose, and throat, internal surgery, pediatrics, pregnancy, postnatal care, toxicology, virilization, which I think is really interesting, fertility and virilization, Rasayana and rejuvenation, which Western medicine has totally ignored, but in the functional medicine circles, there's now all this like new, I'm putting it in air quotes, like new, amazing, like enlightened sense of immunorestoration. Well, that word is Rasayana, and that is from, one branch I'm forgetting that I can't. No, I said ear, nose, and throat. But like those are, a lot of the surgical techniques are what we use today. It was not, when we think about like woo-woo yoga, this is not what Ayurvedic medicine traditionally was or is. The over 1 million active Ayurvedic doctors in India. So this is not a historical, this is not only a historical teaching, this is a current actively practiced thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, thanks for naming those, specialties within Ayurveda. And then, some other similarities too. There's like the humoral system, which is like, I guess, sort of like the predecessor to like our allopathic model, but like it came from Europe. And I feel like it sounds very similar to the doshas also. So it's like, I feel like there's a lot of, like, I'm sure the roots of like, these systems.
So even the caduceus, do you remember the caduceus? So the caduceus, which is like what you see as the doctor symbol, it's like the staff with the snakes and the wings. Is from Ayurveda. That is the center stick is the spine, and it's Sushumna Nadi. And then the 2 snakes are Ida and Pingala Nadi, which are the channels that cross at every chakra. That's what that image is, and come out essentially the Godhead, out of your head, out of your top chakra. And so that is, which is from Hippocrates or the ancient Greek, is exactly an Ayurvedic representation of enlightenment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The chakra, I mean, like driving down the street and you see, that symbol, that doctor symbol, that's from Ayurveda.
Nice. Awesome. That's great. Yeah. See, and this is so much what I love to teach about too, is like uncovering these like hidden histories or these things that we just aren't taught. I'm sure in medical school, they're not teaching them that. That's awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, totally. And I could definitely see a lot of ways. I think when you mentioned the functional medicine too, like I think there seems to be more, definitely more very understanding of like the role of what we eat, nutrition, and like in our health and stuff. So I know like, Ayurveda, that's like my major like focus is like our most ailments in the body can be traced back down to like our digestive health and like how much like ama or toxins we have in our body and how well we're like digesting our, how strong our digestive fire is. And so I know that's been just having like a lot of like family members that have been to like sort of the Western, like the medical school and stuff like that. I know like, I'm pretty sure the amount of nutrition they learn is like maybe 1 month, like maybe a paragraph in the textbook. So it's like, they're not really learning about the points of nutrition. So that's, again, that's a clear, like, and it seems like that's there's growing like sort of understanding and interest of that too. So that seems like that could also, be another good connection, again, connected to food.
Exactly. And they're busy in medical school. It's not like they're not learning other things. It is, to me, if you learn the groundwork from Ayurveda, then a lot of the other things kind of fall into easy place.
Right.
As it's such a principle-based medical system.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like the wisdom of it too, to me, it just was very intuitive. That's why I feel like really, it's brought a lot of meaning to my life and stuff for that way also, for sure. Yeah, that's awesome.
I love that this conversation today has really kind of been so wide-ranging about like the details of Dinacharya to kind of how we can infuse our wellness spaces or our justice spaces with Ayurvedic medicine, about how we can connect and find each other, about how we can essentially subvert the dominant paradigm with gardening and critical relationships and kind of connecting back to ourselves, and ourselves, our people, and our place. That's
Mhm.
kind of our core themes today.
Yes. Awesome. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Anything else that you want to add as we kind of close here? Anything else you want to make sure that we share with our audience today?
Let's see. Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I think we did cover a lot of really powerful ground today. I think maybe just like connecting back to this idea of like maybe looping back to the idea of power. Yeah, there are some things that in our earlier discussions we kind of touched on, but we didn't get a chance to get into here, which is probably fine, maybe a future podcast. But I was just thinking about the role of like, how did our health systems become colonized, and like colonial medicine, all these things, and how I think like certain practices, even how like allopathic practices got sort of like co-opted by like, we call them like the robber barons of Rockefellers and Carnegies in a way to like promote a more capitalist sort of like mindset, like way of thinking and culture and stuff. And so like healthcare was a way to sort of like colonize people. And that was practiced in India too, with like the British also like colonialism kind of really used the body as a site of construction for their own like authority, legitimacy, and control and stuff. And so what does it mean to like sort of decolonize from all this? And again, going back to power, so as we like understand that, like, that power over that kind of a coercive, domineering form of power, that's not really a true form of power, because it's based on force, and so that's not like the true authentic kind of form of power. But the really true source forms of power are like that power within and the power with. And I think there's the invitation to kind of constantly connect those. I know we talked about like the different people that this conversation could sort of speak to in different ways. And so there's folks that are very much in the wellness part and committed to that, and that's great, and that's amazing. And so I think like really tapped into that power within piece. And then I think to also make space for that like power with like now as we're healing myself, like how can I like bring this to the communities that I'm in? Because that's ultimately what social justice is. It's about healing our communities. And so sort of making those connections. And then likewise, for folks that are like really steeped in the social justice work, that are like, kind of martyring themselves for this bigger cause, and, kind of like really like burning out and like all these things, or like reenacting, kind of people, kind of like reenacting trauma onto each other in these ways, like just to, connect to that power with like that. It's not like taking time to like care for oneself, or connecting, one's daily routine to like to try into the alignment of the universe. That's not selfish. That's actually will help you have like more integrity with your work, with your dharma. And so for those folks that are really in that sort of building power with, like to also connect to that power within. So just, I guess, both those, like cultivating the power within and the power with, like just remembering that it's like, it's sort of like a weaving. It's like, kind of both of those together. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Where's my little... All right. And thank you to all of our audience. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together and are committed to sharing knowledge and insight that empower us and our communities towards greater health. Thank you for listening to the NERVeda podcast for complex health, and we will see you next time.